Hello, everyone. We are honored today to have with us Geoffrey Russom, who is Emeritus Professor of English Literature at Brown University, where he had been the Nicholas Brown Professor of Oratory and Belles Lettres. He is the author of several books, including Old English Meter and Linguistic Theory, Beowulf and Old Germanic Meter, and The Evolution of Verse Structure in Old and Middle English Poetry. In addition to work on English verse form, Russom has published articles on the linguistic history of English, the multicultural backgrounds of Beowulf, and the artistic excellence of pre-literate verse traditions. He is best known for arguments showing that rules of poetic meter are abstracted from rules of ordinary language and operate like new linguistic rules. He is with us today to talk about his newest book, which is The Syntax of Beowulf: Word Order, Poetic Meter, and Formulaic Technique in the Old English Verse Clause, which was published by Uppsala Books just about a month ago. So, Professor Russom, thank you for joining us. And I'd like to start us off with a simple question, which is, do you remember when you first read Beowulf and how it struck you at that time?
I was at Stony Brook um, in my first year of graduate school, and it connected with my 1960s interest in folk music, folklore, and sort of pre-capitalist, uh, the pre-capitalist world, the ancient world. Um, Bob Creed was my first Old English teacher. I also took a course from Don Fry and another one from Marty Stevens. So I had three pretty good professors for it. Very helpful. Uh, Bob said to me, since I was considering getting a PhD in modern English, do you want to spend the rest of your life talking about books you've already read? And I began to like books that were problems that were interesting to solve. Um, I also got into Old Irish literature later on and found that to be a neglected treasure house of literary marvels. So it was like discovering an entirely new vein uh, of the kind of books I found really interesting to read.
So, and a follow-up to that question is, more broadly speaking, what motivated you to become a professional scholar of Old English?
Well, I was sort of destined to be a professor of English from a very young age because I was one of these kids with thick glasses who was in libraries all the time. I really loved books, but I wanted to be a professor of Old English because I thought that would help me understand why poetry works the very puzzling way it does. I've always uh, composed poetry for my own pleasure and weddings, funerals, family events, things like that. And I was very puzzled very early on why, once I thought out what I had to say, the poetry just happened in my head. Uh, it's like uh, Chomsky's insistence that um, there's something in your head that knows things that you don't know. There are some things in your mind that can solve problems without uh, your being aware of anything happening. So it was the desire to understand how poetry works, how it can be the way it is, uh, that really made me want to be a professional scholar. And I had been frustrated by when I went to Stanford as an undergraduate, I was very frustrated in not finding anybody who talked about what poetry was in a kind of philosophical way. Um, I took a course from Donald Davidson called Ideas in Literature, and that was the first person who really thought about how poetry and literature more generally actually work, what they're for, what they do. Um, and through getting to know the graduate students in Davidson's class, I discovered linguistics and some linguists who do stylistic analysis who really care about the nuts and bolts of literature. Um, Kind of like a combination between a scientist and a creative writing teacher, that sort of thing. What I wasn't interested in was a sort of kind of clerical work, you know, the research that on notoriously Shakespeare's every little thing Shakespeare ever did kind of research. Didn't want that. So the only way to pursue my interest in poetry and in literature more generally was to become a scholar. No other way to do it. No. I had to make a living, of course, and that was more or less, the way I could make a living doing what I enjoyed.
And you taught at Brown University for how many years?
Oh, from 72 to 2004.
Okay, so 32 years you are teaching there. Is that right?
Oh, something like that.
Okay.
I could do the math and figure out when I retired. Let's see. Uh, well,
Well, in any case,
something like that.
let's just, for the purpose of this question, it's not relevant. It's not significant. So,
Between 35 and 40. Yeah.
okay. So three or between 3 and 4 decades of teaching Beowulf, uh, you're doing. I'm curious to know from all those decades of teaching, what insights would you have about Beowulf that you would share with other teachers of Beowulf? Because, of course, this is something that you, as a professor at Brown, share with thousands of high school teachers around the world and other college professors around the world, is this activity of teaching Beowulf. Um, so, what are some insights you would share with other teachers?
Well, reading Beowulf for a long time and not exhausting its interest, uh, I developed a feel for the poem's emphases, what it really seems to care about, what gets mentioned in different connections, tweaked to fit different situations. What are the poet's real strong interests? And I think I got really into the poem when I started to see what was missing. This is supposed to be a war poem, but if you look at what it says about war, war is a total disaster. It's just bad, all bad. There is no glory in war itself. The villains in the poem, which does have villains, are the ones that start conflicts, Grendel notoriously. The glorious hero is the one, well, the best kind of glorious hero seems to be somebody like Beowulf, who was so competent that nobody attacked his people for 50 years. 50 years of peace and prosperity. What 20th century leader can make that claim for his country? Uh, so there's no, to be a warrior is only glorious if you do your job. And who are you working for? That's one of the mysteries in the poem is who are these warriors working for? Or these fighters, you might call them. Because the poem is not about war. A critic, the famous critic Kerr, whom we edited a book about, sort of lamented that the poet doesn't pay attention to great historical events, by which he meant wars, uh, but pays attention to a monstrous psychopath and a fantasy hero. To me, that's what epics always do. They try to reduce the problem they're dealing with to some sort of conflict between two idealized characters. I suppose in a pre-literate area, that's easier to do for a poet than to elaborate a complicated modern scene with lots of bureaucratic detail in it. James Bond's desk with 5 red phones on it, that sort of detail. But really, the contrast is between truth tellers who are open to other people and schemers who are selfish. Uh, Power isn't glorious in and of itself. It's impressive, but only if used properly. So you have these warriors. Being a warrior doesn't make you a war hero. You have to actually do the job. Uh, the warriors who fail to do the job at the end of the poem, their whole country falls apart. And the mystery for me is who are these people working for? They're called the people in the poem, and they just aren't differentiated. Uh, some critics have said that, have seen sophistication in the poem, kind of Machiavellian machinations and so forth. Those are sort of treated rather contemptuously by the poet. The poet's not trying to show how poet's trying to actually sell the idea that if you have power, you have to use it for the people. That is to keep a whole nation alive and prosperous. And a lot of people have observed the great movement from joy to sorrow and sorrow to joy. That's all illustrating over and over again what happens if um, the mindless aggressor gets his way and nobody is available to oppose him.
So, one insight you would share with teachers then is that Beowulf really violates a lot of the expectations and assumptions that modern readers bring to it. Um, and it's
Yeah,
different from what we might expect. Now, I'll ask a related question, which is how is Beowulf similar to other Indo-European epics, or in what way is it typical of the Indo-European epic?
Yeah, well, if you look at Homer's poetry or any of the myths in a book by Calvert Watkins on these Indo-European myths in languages remotely related to English, um, what you find is a an idealized character who is strong enough to defend a whole society single-handed against what Watkins calls chaos monsters, dragons, giants, idealized, bad guys who are bad right through and very big and very scary. So that basic structure is there, but the hero's duty is the duty of the remarkably strong person is to step forward and oppose some kind of attack on a society that nobody else could uh, um, deal with. Uh, and Beowulf is definitely typical in that way, but the Indo-European heroes are generally not like American or European war heroes of the modern period. Um, what never happens is that, in Beowulf anyway, is that a warrior wants more war so that he can get glory or plunder. Tacitus said that the Germanic peoples, that the warriors really got impatient if there were no wars to fight. And you find that attitude in some of the Norse material too, some of the earliest material, not all of it by any means. Many of the attitudes that um, have to do with trying to control violence are also in the earlier Norse poetry, with its emphasis on ancient laws that are were preserved orally all over the North. Um, and but Beowulf seems to be especially concerned about minimizing any temptation to start a war just because you want to show how strong you are. Plunder, for example. Beowulf's uncle is praised in many ways in the poem, but when he invades France, the poet says right out, that was foolish. So this is not a Viking. I think if I had to tell somebody who'd never read the poem what's commonly misunderstood about it, it would be the notion that Beowulf is anything like a Viking. The Vikings, the Vikings were well, there was this law that only the first son inherited land, or the daughter if there was no son. Um, and the second son would need to find another way to make a living in many cases. The Vikings were kids who didn't have a job. Uh, Beowulf was not one of them. He was raised in a court where people had responsibilities. Um, one of the other things I would say about him is he's pretty much a Boy Scout. He goes to he has respect for his elders that you do not find in uh, Patton, for example, or any other standard comic book war hero that you might want to look at. And by the way, I think you really start to understand Beowulf by the comparative method if you put him beside comic book heroes of the 20th century. He is so different. He's a little like Clark Kent. He's mild-mannered. The poet said when he was young, they kind of thought he was a wimp, and even his uncle didn't think much of him. But then he goes out and kills a bunch of giants, and all of a sudden he's a hero. Uh, Interesting. But in many cases, you'll find stark contrasts. Um, these are pretty important issues. And
Absolutely.
yeah, one of the reasons uh, that I believe in scholarship is that this is a poem that could be used to to advance a lot of political agendas that it's not really very well structured to serve, fortunately, in my opinion. Uh, the only way to make sure it's not misappropriated is some kind of myth of national origin and glory. Uh, I think England could be proud of it. It's a wonderful document. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. Um, but it's not like the Aeneid, which uh, sets one nation against the others as more glorious. In fact, there's no concept that any one people is more glorious than any other anywhere in that poem. You won't find any of the extreme nationalist ideas that have dominated the 20th century in it at all. You look, you won't find it. So the silences in the poem are very important. But the emphasis that goes against the silence is don't start conflicts.
Mm.
And if you do, if conflicts get started, try to resolve them by diplomacy. Hrothgar is the one who, Beowulf goes to help Hrothgar because Hrothgar got his father out of trouble by settling a feud that his father was involved in. And Hrothgar is presented as one who settles feuds by diplomacy. Uh, that's the respect for law, traditional law. Not really anything there to object to. Very clever. I mean, as you know, I'm sure, as a student of the poem, um, there are clubs of lawyers who read Njal Saga because the legal aspect of it is so thoroughly elaborated and so really interesting. Uh, the if you look at Grendel, what the poet finds horrible about him, uh, it's really quite peculiar. You know, in a High Middle Ages knights in shining armor type poem, heroes just see monsters and kill them, and uh, to prove themselves. Uh, Gawain poet confronts a lot of monsters, kills a lot of monsters on his way to meet Sir Bersilac. Uh, but in Beowulf, the poet builds a legal case against the monster very carefully, as if you shouldn't just go out and kill a monster for no reason. The monster's off base in part because he refuses to uh, submit to negotiation to settle the feud. He won't pay compensation for his killings. He completely, he's an outlaw in a sense that's sharper than our concept of outlaw. And he's not heroic for it. Uh, he's the outlaw you cannot love. You're not going to admire him the way people admire Jesse James or Billy the Kid in Western hero tales of a similar type.
So, Rick, you have commented on the characterization of Beowulf and just now on the characterization of Grendel. I'd like to ask you for your thoughts on three other people, uh, two of them in the poem, one of them outside of the poem. Those people are Hrothgar, Wealhtheow, and the Beowulf poet himself. What's your take on these three personages?
Well, you know, I try to resist the temptation of reading the poet of a poem I admire as somebody like me, but I think the poet is an experienced, maybe elderly man, elderly for his time, for example. He doesn't have the good docs I had. Uh, the sympathy for old age, Hrothgar in particular, is quite remarkable in this poem. It might be one of those touches that seems to emerge when Christianity is first integrated into a culture. The sort of basic Christianity of the concept of charity and so forth. So I think what's striking about Hrothgar and Wealhtheow is that they're diplomats. Her speech, when Hrothgar sort of wants to adopt Beowulf as a son, and she, as a Germanic wife, is actually a diplomat from her own tribe or people to her husband's tribe or people. And if her husband doesn't respect that link, uh, the marriage is really off. So she comes right out and says with it in the most amazingly effective and polite and non uh, aggressive way that it won't do to disinherit her sons. They're both diplomats, and they're both the kind of people that the poet respects, the ones who solve problems without creating conflict. Um, One of the interesting things of Beowulf, one of the ways he's kind of like a Boy Scout, is that even though he's going to solve their problems single-handed, he treats his elders, uh, Hrothgar and Wealhtheow, with great deference and respect. And this is reinforced because it's not just when he's in their presence. When he reports back to his uncle, he says he's very impressed with the glorious Wealhtheow. And well, he might be because her her remarks in the poem are very shrewd, and you have a sense of a very bright and effective woman indeed. Um, Hrothgar is, well, Beowulf, the idea that Beowulf was a wimp when he was a young man and later proved himself to be tough. Hrothgar is real sentimental and cries, when Beowulf is leaving, really emotional, and is a poet himself. Uh, this is not taken as a sign of weakness. As a matter of fact, if you know any really scary uh, people, like I kind of saw in Detroit when I was a kid, they could be quite emotional. But the thing is, if you said, ha ha, get your knuckles out of your eyes, you're crying, you're dead. So he has the kind of power that allows himself to be emotional, and it's not represented as a weakness. Those kinds of feelings of love and loyalty, the things that hold people together, those are very positively viewed throughout the poem. Good emotions are really good. Uh, so when he recites the sort of the many things from his life that bring up strong feelings within him, I think that's the poet channeling Hrothgar a little bit. So I think the poet is an experienced person. You know, in the old English monasteries, there were retired warriors. I think Calvin Kendall imagines the poet as somebody like that. Uh, that would that would be the kind of person who could write the poem. The person who's actually had the experience of war, which and also been introduced to Christianity, um, and who therefore uh, has this total reluctance to glorify war in and of itself. And what he glorifies is really minimizing the damn thing.
Hmm. Well, thanks, Rick, for those answers. I'll just say your interpretation of Hrothgar strikes me as very convincing, but it might be worth pointing out for the audience that in some ways your reading goes against many readings of Hrothgar, which interpret his tendency to be emotional and his seeming weakness as a sign that he's being characterized negatively. I don't believe that. And I think your interpretation presents us with several good reasons to be convinced that Hrothgar is a positively depicted figure in the poem.
Well, yeah, I think those interpretations are kind of parallel to thinking Beowulf was a wimp because he was mild-mannered as a young man. Uh, since Machiavelli, the worship of pure power has um, ex even accelerated, I think. And the poet never worships power for its own sake. That's why this bad guy Hermod is in the poem. He's a strong champion who abuses those, even those who are close to him, who should be bound to him by and mutual bonds of love and loyalty. But he actually kills his own table companions, his own men, uh, uh, when they are drinking. That is taboo. When people are drinking in a hall, violence is against the law. And if you get killed when you start a fight in a drinking hall, you are not avengable. You are officially a suicide. It's totally on you. So again, you have this emphasis on if you have a lot of power, you have to control it and you have to use it to help create this domain of peace and prosperity. That is the only thing you are good for.
Great point, Rick. And back in 1978, you published an article in Speculum, I believe, called A Germanic Concept of Nobility in Beowulf and the Gifts of Men. And in that article, you very persuasively argued that some of the feats of Beowulf, such as his swimming contest with Brecca, these are not trivial accomplishments. These are very highly valued accomplishments in the society that produced the poem. While we're talking about the interpretation of Beowulf, I wonder if you could say a bit more about that argument and perhaps if there's any additions to it you'd like to make almost 50 years later.
Uh, actually, I'm not sure I would change anything. Uh, what you notice and what I rather like about um, societies before the state, heroic societies, is the absence of a hard and fast line between arts and crafts. If you went to dinner uh, at King Olaf Haraldsson's Norwegian Hall, and you were an honored guest, he might slaughter the ox himself just to show he could do it. Uh, well, uh, he was a jewelsmith, the King of Norway. That was his hobby. He was like a prosperous fellow who has a kind of shop in his basement and makes furniture, that kind of thing. Uh, you see in this poem, well, Plato in advancing his arguments that poets are all liars, talked about the representation of Achilles' shield by Homer. And what Plato says is this guy has never seen a real shield, to judge from his poem. It's really about the designs on the shield. The Beowulf poet is quite different. The Beowulf poet knows about all the arts and crafts that he represents in the poem. And that wouldn't be surprising because if he was an important man with uh, military experience, um, he would have probably had a couple of hobbies and like the kings, and might have known how to do quite a few of the crafts that he describes. We don't know for sure, but we do know that there were very important people who thought these crafts were worth pursuing. Carpentry is another thing. One of the most, there were a lot of powerful people besides warriors. There were also prosperous farmers who you didn't want to mess with because they had their own power. Some Viking raids, they picked the wrong farmer, and they ended up having to work for the farmer for nothing as servants. Um, and you also, one of the most important kinds of people in the poem or in the culture are shipwrights. And people who make ships and people who make hulls, carpenters who can make large things. The description of Herod, all those details, that's very typical of early cultures. In the Irish uh, sagas, you also find in Fled Brickrun description of the building of a hall and everybody who was involved in it, including the strong men who set the pillars that support the hall and so forth. Uh, it's very different from talking about uh, someone with power who commands a hall to be built. Uh, that's characteristic of the later Middle Ages, where all of a sudden crafts are things that are done by workers of a lower status. And high status becomes visible when you don't have to do any work. When you, issue commands and other people do it. This is uh, this is a time when everybody wants to show that they can do something useful, including the most important people in the society. You have to prove yourself.
So, Rick, we will transition soon to a discussion of your book and to meter and language and things like that. But while we're on the subject of the interpretation of Beowulf, I'll just ask a question, which is, are there any areas of research that you would recommend for aspiring scholars? Are there any, let's say this, are there any passages in Beowulf that you think are not adequately understood? Or any issues you feel could be improved upon?
Well, I think the more you study the language, whether you study the meter specifically or not, the better you understand the poem. Although it does seem to be a little less toward the Viking side of things than the Norse, some of the Norse poetry, and in particular the skaldic poetry. That's a little later, and it's very, it's more like Middle English poetry in terms of the way the warriors and kings view themselves. But I think it's not so much that the things have been neglected, but that the value of things haven't been appreciated. If you read widely in Old Norse literature and at whatever level you want to engage it, I mean, if you're a scholar, you would probably want to learn Old Norse and read at least some of it in the original. But the more of it you read, the more you see that this is a very coherent society. One of the remarkable things is that it's so coherent, even though it was scattered all over Northern Europe in relatively small settlements by modern standards. People took the system of laws and customs with them over long distances and maintained them in an oral tradition. So I would say the more you can try to reconstruct the oral tradition behind Norse, English, Old High German, whatever, Old Saxon, the more you can engage effectively the main problem, which is how did these pre-literate uh, worldviews, or actually a pretty much standard pre-literate worldview, interact with the forces that were being brought to bear on England by uh, the Christian mission and the and Roman law.